Very interesting.
Oh, I'm sure.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so,
Yeah, go ahead.
okay, good afternoon, ladies, and no more gentlemen after I scared them away that time. So funny. Poor guy, like, I never stay here where they're gonna bash me. That was for women talking. I don't know if you were all here. I don't know, and I remember that. This one gentleman came in and I just didn't realize.
Well,
it
he
either
heard
was-
everything again.
Everything, yeah, that the book was a very, yeah, the women were abused in the story. Women talking, my very.
Oh, I
famous.
saw the movie.
Yeah, right, they
Yeah,
should hear
we
it
also
when they
did.
showed it here last month.
Yeah.
But it wasn't done the same way as the book.
No, that's what I read, that it, I mean, I just saw bits of that. I
Not
haven't
at
seen the
all.
movie. It was done differently, yeah. Which, you know what, they're two different media, book and film, so I guess you do it differently.
Which
but-
is better.
Oh, it's
The
just
books
different.
are always
I could
better.
live without both of them, but
Honestly, right, you could live without both of them, but.
It's amazing how to get out of the cult. How you assume your own power back.
It was,
It's a depressing movie, but in a sense, but it. me box of ourselves out of that.
and the book was, I don't know if you, did you read that, if you read the book, it was, yeah, it was interesting. Okay, so something totally, I guess, different, and I was just saying that I don't remember how I came to choose this book, or where I saw it reviewed, or like, you know, how you start looking up one thing and it leads you to another thing, and leads you to another thing, and then I don't know where you went up. But anyhow, I thought it looked interesting, and a confession, I also don't like long books anymore, like really long books. So I don't only pick according to length. That would not be very professional, but it's a small book. It's this writer's first novel, translated from the French. And who read it? Who was able to?
it's very difficult to get the book.
Yeah.
Put your name down and
I'm still number 5.
I don't know what number I am. I'm gonna read it eventually, but you can't get it
Yeah.
in there.
Oh,
It's been very
I will
difficult.
take note.
okay.
I will send an email.
Yeah, I'm sorry, because it's, you know, it's so different when it can be a book discussion and like, or versus I'm telling you about it because you haven't read it. So,
Now we'll see whether we want to or not.
yeah, okay. So let me tell you about it. So it translated from the French, and the French title, the book was published in 2019 in French and last year in English. And the French title is literally the same, you know, sometimes titles are different, but it's Tous tes enfants dispersés. So that's really all your children scattered, except there's no comma between enfant and dispersé in the French, which I thought was interesting, because here in the English, it's all your children, comma, scattered. So this is the author's, and her name is Beata, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly. She's a Rwandan writer, Beata Umubyeyi Mairesse. So she's with a, she's half Rwandan and half French. So and she writes in French. Her first language was the Rwandan main language, which is called Kinya Rwanda.
I'm sorry. Oh, I better get my phone.
Yeah, maybe everybody turn off your mind. Just a reminder to turn off the sound on your phones in case they're on. I see, I just. I say I have my sound off. Yes, so.
Hi, Joe. Oh, Mirta. Oh, no, hold on, I'll just get you.
So this young writer, she was born in 1979, which makes her 44 years old now. Born in Rwanda, in Butare, which is the city that she writes about in this novel. She was, and as we all know, because the book and what she writes about in her, previously, she's written short stories and poetry. I mean, she started with poetry and then short stories, and now has lengthened the scope of her writing to the novel form. And then is apparently after this, I read that she's coming out, she's writing a work of nonfiction, which is, again, very different from when you're writing fiction. All her other work was fiction. So she was born in Rwanda. As I said, her mother tongue was Kinyarwanda, which is the language spoken in Rwanda. She is a survivor of the genocide in Rwanda, and we all remember that, I think, in 1994. Pardon? She's half French and half Tutsi. Yes, that's what she is. She's a mixed race, which comes out very much in the book because she herself, her characters are, and she herself is. And I listened to a couple of interviews with her. She's this lovely, very eloquent, soft-spoken young woman. And she talks about being that her one parent is white and one parent is black, and this whole idea of being of what she calls, I'm labeled as mixed race. And when I go to Rwanda, I'm looked upon as white. And when I'm in France, I'm looked upon as darker than most of the French people. So that's a very big part of her writing. But anyway, she was in Rwanda in 1994, and she and her mother were able to escape. So they got out on one of the convoys. I think it was a UN convoy, or maybe not a UN, but one of the convoys of Europeans that were leaving. And she and her mother were very lucky and were able to flee. And she survived. She went to France, and she grew up in France, and she had her schooling from then on in France. She lives in France today in the city of Bordeaux, which is where the character in the novel lives. So there are definitely elements of the story that are autobiographical, although she's interesting because in the interviews, and I listened to a few interviews with her, she says, this seems to be a popular question. How much of this is autobiographical? How much of this is your story? And she said, I like to quote Nadine Gordimer. I don't know if anybody remembers Nadine Gordimer, South African, a wonderful South African writer who wrote years ago. I remember reading her books, many years ago. Nadine Gordimer was a white Jewish South African writer, but very, very a very strong and powerful voice against apartheid. And she said, but this Beata Mairesse says, Nadine Gordimer also used to be asked how much of your books are autobiographical. And she says, it's not important. Like, yes, it's important in the way for me, because if I have certain things I want to say and I say them I can say them in my fiction, it is fiction, fictional writing. But she said that's not the main point of my story. So I thought, that was interesting, because that's the question that came up in every single interview, I guess, except ones where the interviewers had listened already and knew that she had answered this question. So she lives and she writes in French, but her mother tongue is the traditional Rwandan language. And which she speaks and she writes, and she said that, but she's very pleased that, so the book was written in French and translated into English and I think, again, I didn't read it in the French, although it would be nice to try reading bits of it in the French to see how the translation is. The translation has been acclaimed, and again, translation, because we did that on the Japanese, the book, a couple of, was that last month or a couple of months ago? Months go too quickly. Was it last month?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, okay, Japanese and English are very, very far apart, and I have no idea. I mean, I guess the idea that you can have if the translation is good is how it reads to you when you're reading in English. If you feel that there's something like strange about it or something awkward or that doesn't sound right, I guess even if you don't know the language that the book was written in originally, you have a sense it wasn't so good. But her translation seems to be very good. It's been acclaimed by many reviewers. And this particular translator, she's translated many novels. And remember, I don't know how many years ago this was, but we did the book translated also from the French by Muriel Barbery, The Elegance of the Hedgehog. Do you remember that?
Oh,
one? That was a lovely book.
Yeah.
That woman who was the concierge in the apartment building, and anyway, she was this translator, Alison Anderson, was the translator of that as well. So do you remember? I
Yeah,
don't-
yeah.
again, I don't know how many years ago, but it was a long time ago, right? I know the years go by. So in this book, the way the author has chosen to write it, and she said this in her interviews, that when she was asked what made you wanted to tell a story, and the story is, I guess it has to do with the genocide in Rwanda, because that's the thing that's hanging over that she talks about, but the book is not done in a manner that makes the genocide, it's always there, but it's not described in great detail. The horrors, a sentence here, a sentence there, are more alluded to. And what the author is interested in doing is looking at the effects that this horrible genocide it went on. And so then I looked up Rwandan history. And if you go back and look up the history of Rwanda, like back from the couple of centuries ago, you can see like how this led up to it. And there have been civil wars and killings and really slaughters of the two main groups. So Rwanda is basically, from what I read, divided into their two main groups, the Tutsis and the Hutus, which we in the West, like, who didn't maybe know too much about Rwanda until this happened. And Rwanda, if you look at the map, is a very small landlocked country in the middle of the huge continent of Africa that apparently is a very poor country, agrarian and pastoral, but not one of the countries that was like, South Africa is known for its diamonds and many of the other countries have oil and have these riches, which was why the Europeans, when they ran out of goodies in Europe, went looking, in other places. Like, why did they go to Africa to colonize in the beginning? Because there were things there that they wanted. So Africa was full of resources, but it doesn't seem like Rwanda is particularly rich in those resources. And it was given for a while. It was when Africa was divided up among the Europeans in the late 19th century, when it began, it was between Belgium and France and Germany. Italy had a little bit there. England had its pieces too. Was Holland in Africa? I don't know. Anyway, so Rwanda was originally given to Germany, and after the First World War, it was switched over, became a Belgian protectorate, which is why French, it was a language there, and why this author and other members of her family speak French, or their place that they were naturally going to would be Belgium or France. And so, but when you look at the history there and the groups, again, this is only looking it up on Wikipedia, so I just take what I can get. I'm by no means an expert. I just wanted to know a little bit of the background. I remember how horrible it was at the time, but I don't remember the details or the why. And so there are the main two groups are the Hutus and the Tutsis, and then there's a smaller third group called the Twa, or Pygmy people, as they're called. Again, this is just what I get from Wikipedia. But the Hutus and the Tutsis were the main groups, and over the last couple of centuries, and they speak the same languages. The same language. There's not two different languages, as in Canada or as in Belgium, where you have the Flemish and the French, or as in other countries. They speak the same language. They maybe came from different parts of Africa, and when the colonial powers came, so they did, and this was apparently, sure, it was the Germans or the Belgians, made the inhabitants of the country, they divided them officially by race. So they had these cards, these identity cards that they had to carry that stated whether they were Tutsi or Hutu. or toi, the third group, on a card, on an identity card. So yes, the groups existed before, but nobody actually took the Europeans to come in and give them cards. So when this genocide, and as I said, there had been uprisings and killings in the years before when Rwanda became, around 1949, became an independent country. But then, because she talks about it in the book, one of the characters remembers when she started to, the first time she saw white people and how odd white people looked like. And, you know, from the point of view of a darker skinned person, white people are weird there. And I think in other languages, the term for white person is like ghost. And they think that in the book it's considered, and you think of it like a skinned rabbit, you know, what happened to these poor people, and their eyes are strange colors and their hair is strange colors. Like she talks about being a young child and never having seen, not the author or the young woman in character who's about her age, it's the previous generations, you know, when they first saw white people, they thought this was very strange. Anyway, the Europeans came, and then of course the Catholic Church came, and the other missionary groups came, and they did their work there as well. But this genocide that took place 3 months from the beginning of April, so it was April, May, June, in that time period, and its statistics are different depending where you look, but it seems to be in the figure of, like by most accepted, you know, historians, and is around 500,000 people. 500,000 people in 3 months. But the killings were horrible.
Yeah.
Like if you remember, they and people killed their neighbors, and it was these old seated hatreds or feelings of one group being favored over the other group, and you know, one group became more the Tutsis were the preferred ones by the Belgians, and then the Hutus came, and it was who held the civil service positions. That was a big deal in colonized countries. It was a very big deal, because then you got to be, especially that's why people were able to go over to France, because, you know, if they had one parent who was French or Belgian, then, you know, you could. So, but the killings, and she references them in this book, were of such a violent nature. And when you read about this, and you read how and this didn't come out of nowhere, like this massacre was being planned. And as we know from our wonderful hero, Romeo Dallaire, who was really, like, what a person is, I mean, who was there working for the UN, who saw what was going on, as did many others, and who said, remember this, he said to the UN, we have to do something. There is this genocide. There is this huge massacre being planned. Machetes are being given out to everybody around with instructions. And you read this, with instructions to kill the opposing, like the Hutus, to go and to kill your Tutsi neighbors at the worst way possible. The machetes were studded with nails, and they raped the women, but they raped the women not just the way but the way, you know, soldiers worldwide are known during war to rape women. It's horrific, and it happens. But in this case, they were, and this is what I was reading, and again, it just makes this was the background that I was reading for this book, that, you know, raped the women, and they let out groups of prisoners with AIDS and told them to go and rape why? Because then, if you didn't kill them, you made a next generation ill with AIDS. And do you remember, there were pictures after the massacre was over, and of these children who were orphans, and I mean, this was a few years later, who had been born with AIDS and with hepatitis C and with other diseases that were, and this was purposely done, and they were in these camps with no parents, because the parents had all been killed. I mean, it's such a horror. And Romeo Dallaire, because I was reading about him too, you know, he said he still suffers from PTSD, of course, understandably, I know, and he's a very, like, strongly, he fights that this should all be known and exposed. And his whole life's mission now is trying to deal with the after effects of this genocide and to do something, because it must hang over him, although he did whatever he could, and the UN said to him, go away, and they left. Remember, they left. They left the peoples there to kill and to be killed. And so it's this horror, it's this genocide that this Beata Mairesse, the Beata Umubyeyi, I'm so sorry, I don't say her name so well, but anyways, I will call her Beata Mairesse because it's easier for me, that she writes about, because she, and as I said, she and her mother, so she was born in 1979, so she was 15 years old when it took place, and she and her mother were lucky and were able to escape to France. Most of their family was not so lucky, so this is what she writes about. But she said very much, my purpose in writing this was, yes, to write about it, but not only, and I didn't want to make it a book about describing what happened. I wanted to show the effects on the different generations. So you could say it's a 3-generational family story. Somehow saga seems too big a word for this little book of 180 pages, which is small, but it's told through 3 voices. So the opening voice is that of, so it's a mother, a grandmother, and a grandson, and the opening voice is the voice of the daughter, say the daughter who would be the author's age, and her name, and names are very important in here, her name is Blanche. You know, yes, her mother, who is African, gave her daughter, who had a white father, the name Blanche. And because she said to her, and this was when they were living in Rwanda, but this is a good thing, you know, you're mixed race. So let's emphasize the Blanche part of you, because this might be good for you, you know, in your future lives. You have Blanche, the daughter, you have her mother, Immaculata, who has, they have Rwandan names as well, but these are their Europeanized names. So Immaculata, which is a little bit ironic because Immaculata had a lover and she got pregnant, you know, twice out of wedlock. So it was kind of, she was a very good traditional Rwandan girl, and then, so that's a little bit of irony in that. And the third, and she's the grandmother, and she survives the genocide by hiding in a basement, in a cellar for the 3 months of the killings in the city where she was living, and survives and comes out starved, but comes out. Her daughter Blanche was able to get her daughter out. So her daughter did not, as Beata, the author, was also able to get out, although again, you see, it's not completely, or as she said, it doesn't matter, it's not supposed to be autobiographical, because in real life, both mother and author escape, but in the book, no. And then there's the grandson. Blanche has a daughter. She goes to France. She marries a Black man, but he's not from Africa. He's from Martinique, and he also has his own identity issues. And it's very interesting because it's this whole, also, among other things, the book looks at this idea of skin color, but also of, and you know, again, how absurd it all is, you know, the white and the Black and the mixed and the, but also this idea of race and of where do you belong, because the husband of Blanche's husband, who she meets when she goes to live in France, he's also mixed race. I'm sorry, his mother is French, but his father is from Martinique, and he doesn't know where he fits. And he tries at one point to go to Rwanda with Blanche, and he doesn't feel comfortable because he's not from there. He's from a different place in the world. So it doesn't matter what color his skin is. I mean, this is just the surface layer, which I thought was such a good metaphor when these Black kids for the first time see white people and think that they're really so bizarre looking, like skinned rabbits or ghosts, because it's just so, you know. And the third generation is Blanche's son Stokely, the grandson of Immaculata, who is this kid who grows up in France and has been given the name by his father of one of the Black Panthers. You remember Stokely Carmichael from that? So that's who Stokely, this young generation kid, is named after. So you have 3 generations and you have 3 voices. And she divides the book into, like, the contents are Blanche, Immaculata, Stokely, Blanche, Immaculata, Blanche, Stokely. So these are the 3 different voices. So which it's not, the voices themselves are not confusing because you are told clearly who is doing the talking. Their name is at the title of the, as the top of each chapter. But the story is not told in a linear fashion. And the author has said, time, it goes back and forth, just like out inside our heads, everything goes back and forth and round, and we relive, and some new information comes to light, and then we go back to things that happened to us 50 years ago, or things that happened to us 3 months ago. So she tells the story. So you find out the story of the characters as the chapters go on, not necessarily in their own words only, also in the words of the other 2 characters. She begins the book but with 3 epigraphs. And as I always say, epigraphs are really interesting. You have to read them to see what the author means to say in the coming book. So the first one is a quote from a French writer. And this is what he says: I reread the books I like, and I like the books I reread, each time with the same pleasure of closeness, complicity, or better still, beyond that, a long lost kinship found at last. So that's about rereading the books that you like and getting pleasure and something different out of it each time. And books and words and language are also a huge part of this story. Like, she's very much in, and she's a poet, so she plays with words, and she's an author too, but poetry is a whole other level of language where you savor each word and you choose each word with such care. So words, very big. Then the second bit, epigraph, which is really one of the themes of the book, is it's a Rwandan proverb. So it's written first in Kinyarwanda, but the English translation is, the neck is the lid of sorrow. So I had no idea what that meant when I read it. I thought, I don't know, what does that mean? The neck is the lid of sorrow. Okay, that's the second one. And the third quote is, as she fell asleep, she placed one soft hand over her land. It was a gesture of belonging. So there you do with land. So the first one is books. The next one is to do with sorrow. And the third one is land and belonging to a place. So those are the 3 epigraphs. This is what we're going to be getting in the book. Opens with Blanche, who is the daughter of, I guess, 40-something-year-old character. And how ironic, but there's this idea of peace, which would be the last thing that you would think of, that you would expect when you're reading a book about, well, characters, but the effects of this genocide over them. So how does she open the book? The first sentence, it's in the voice of Blanche. It's that time of day when peace ventures outside. Our killers are tired from their long day's work. They're heading home to wash their feet and get some rest. This isn't really Blanche going to be talking. This is her mother talking, but Blanche is quoting her mother. Our killers are heading home to wash their feet and get some rest. We let our hearts nod off for a moment and wait for dark night to fall, so we can go out and scratch the earth for a yam root or some sweet potatoes to eat, a puddle of water to sip. Between them and us, the dogs who have been running all day, begin to get drowsy, their bellies stuffed with a human feast their race is not about to forget. Soon they'll turn wild and even start biting into living, moving flesh, because they figured out that there are no longer any borders between animals and their masters. But for the time being, tiny, clandestine peace knows that there's not a single living soul out on the roads that can capture it. And so it can go out to greet the tall grasses as they straighten their spines on the hillsides, and the birds that stay all day with their heads tucked under their wings so as not to bear witness, so they'll never be called to testify at some tribunal, a day which will surely come. Peace goes out to greet the flowers gorged with water from the rainy season, still struggling to exhale a fragrance of life in spite of it all, in a place where the stench of rot has seeped into everything.
Wow.
How's that for a beginning? And then Blanche says, That's what you would say when you still used to speak, mama. Your words full of holes while you waited for your son Bosco to come back from the cabaret that night in 1997. You would use the present tense at that late hour of the day to share your memories of the month of April 1994, as if those 3 years had not irredeemably separated us. So what we're finding out, the opening scene, this is the quote from Immaculata, who at this point is mute. She stopped talking because whatever reason, this is how she's dealing with her sorrow, and when she stops talking, she becomes mute. But in 1997, which is the time that this story opens, 3 years after the genocide, the daughter Blanche has gone back to Rwanda to see her mother. And the two women are sitting outside and smoking. And they're each smoking, and they smoke different brands of cigarettes. And there's that scene where one is her, and as the daughter says, your brand is called Impala and mine Intore, two cigarette brands from before, the only ones we still wanted to smoke. And so Intore is a warrior dancer and Impala is an antelope. And those are the names of the brands of cigarettes. So that's like, this is the opening scene. And so they're talking. So the daughter is saying to her mother, if you would speak, because now you're not speaking, this is what you used to tell us. So we know here, this is not going to be a light, fluffy story, and we're going to be dealing with the horrors of what began in the month of April, 1994. But what the book continues to do in the alternating chapters, it tells us the story of Immaculata, who was born, as the author said in an interview, she said, I had Immaculata born in the year around when Rwanda became independent in 1949, because she was of a particular generation and she wanted her to be like that. So she describes the character of Immaculata, who until her secondary school begins, she only speaks the native language to Rwanda, but then is sent, this is the mother Immaculata, to a secondary school that's run by the nuns, with an occasional priest as a teacher, and she has to speak only French from now on. The native Rwandan language is forbidden. The girls, if they speak it, a dunce cap is put on their head and they have to sit there with a sign on them, because the French want the girls to be brought up, especially if they're going to be proper educated young ladies, they have to speak French, not this, this heathen language that they grow up with. So the idea of language and words, as I say, is very important into the book. What the language you speak is extremely important. And what
But wasn't it, you said at that time it was an independent country in 1949.
in
So
1949.
why did the French?
So
decide
when she said, that's it, she said 1949, I think 1962, from what I remember, I didn't print out all my stuff that I was reading, was when it was officially became, but in 1949, it's some other different level of independence. Maybe it was, you know what, I can't, but the borders were formed in a different way. In some, 1962, I believe, was when Belgium left, when it was no longer under, protectorate of Belgium. But in 1949, there was this other kind of opening up, because that's what she said. I know, because I was thinking about that, but I thought it was 1962. But she said, I wanted that in 1949, there was, I don't know, I have to go look it up again, but what it was that Rwanda became, at least I don't know, because before that also, a lot of these countries in Africa, so they weren't divided in the same way. 1962, right? But what was in 1949?
The July 1st, 62, Belgium granted formal political independence to Rwanda.
Right. But in 1949, because she said, although, wait a minute, 1949, oh, so no, sorry, yes, that works, sorry. Yes, 1962, because if she has Immaculata born in 1949, 1962 would be when she starts secondary school. Okay, so there you go, that's it, 1962. But that was still, yes, so that's the answer to that. So this idea of language and words and how to communicate is a very big theme. Words. Then another theme that she has running through the book is music. Because music is, as we all know, is it's its own separate kind of language, where you don't need words to. I mean, songs can have words to them, but the music itself is a language of its own. And that's another important part that she puts here. She has the different kinds of music. Immaculata loves, they love listening to the radio. That's a really big deal. When a neighbor has a radio or the grandparents have a radio in their village, they go over and they listen to the radio. And when I was reading about the massacres too, an interesting thing, that little bit that I read was that there was one official Rwandan radio station. And then when this insurgence was being planned, when the different guerrilla groups, the Hutus, were building up their power, they opened their own radio station and they broadcasted, because people living in the outlying areas, they didn't have access to media. I mean, you have to remember back, right, in the 60s and 70s and 80s, there was no internet. And so radio was very important. So they started another radio station that broadcast the propaganda of these Hutu groups that were promoting the genocide. And it was through these radio broadcasts that they would incite their fellow Hutus to plan to kill their Tutsi neighbors. And sometimes it wasn't only neighbors, sometimes a Hutu and a Tutsi were married to each other. And then you were killing members of your extended family. I mean, it was, anyway. So, but music is very important. And Stokely, the third generation, this grandson, who was born in France, who lives in France, who doesn't know his grandmother very well until the end of the story, when grandmother Immaculata finally goes to France and visits. And he starts to form a relationship with his grandmother, and he loves music. I mean, and his parents loved music, and he loves music. And he, in an interesting, ironic twist she has here, he, Stokely, learns to play the clarinet. But his parents, especially his father, who named him after this Black Panther, Stokely Carmichael, is very upset that his son is learning the clarinet, because the clarinet is a European instrument. You know, at least learn the drums or learn something. But this, and you know, and he says to his son, like, what good is this instrument going to do? You think that you're going to get a job in an orchestra in France? You know, you're of a darker skin. Like, that's not the way things work. But Stokely continues and plays his clarinet. So music, it seems that she's saying, is another way to cross barriers, cross boundaries that language can't, because language you have to learn, but music is this international language. The author very strongly believes, and she said that in her interviews, the power of literature, that words can be bridges. And the reason she said for her it's important to write is to debunk stereotypes, because she feels that the more words there are, the more stories are written, then hopefully the more people will not believe in stereotypes. So she said, that's what I really would like to do. That's why I had to have 3 voices, and I mixed the races, although she says, I'm of mixed race too, whatever that is, you know. And it's just so strange for me to, and a hard thing when you grow up is you have to choose between one race or the other, or, you know, one color, like whatever my skin color is. But as I say, I go to Rwanda and they look at me as white, and in France they look at me as darker skin. So I'm the same person. What am I supposed to do with this? She said, this is a real challenge. So she writes because of this. And she said, I thought this was something, I guess for personal reason, interesting. She said she read books, but there's a French writer, and I forget her name, she said it very quickly, a Holocaust survivor, a woman writer, who started to write in, I don't know if her books are translated into English, the name didn't sound too familiar, who wrote books. She was in Auschwitz, this French writer, and apparently she said, at least that's what the author of this book said, that she heard in an interview that this other author had said, when she was in Auschwitz, she said, if I am lucky enough to survive this other Holocaust, then I'm going to write about it. But I'm not going to write about it right away, because it's going to take time. It will have to be, imagine saying this like in 1944 or whenever this was in that place, that it's going to take a while for people to be for me to write about it, to be able to write about it, and for people to be able to listen to it and read what I write about it. So she also says it's almost 30 years since the Rwandan genocide. And she says, so now I decided I can write about it. And she quoted this woman. And what's interesting too, I guess, Danny, you're the only one who read the book, but at the end, there's a little bit where Stokely, the grandson, is at his lycée in France, and he writes to his grandmother in a letter that today we had an older Holocaust survivor who came to talk to our class about his experiences. And this is Stokely, the young boy, is telling his grandmother in a letter that he writes her because he's in France and she's in Rwanda. And, I was upset at my classmates because my classmates weren't paying attention. So this is at the end of the book when Stokely is writing this letter. He says to his grandmother, "Today an old Jewish man came to speak to us at the lycée about his experience. They gathered us all in the cafeteria to listen to him. As a child during the Holocaust, he'd been hidden. He told us how his parents had sent him to the south of France, then to Switzerland, the yellow stars they'd have to sew onto their clothes, the fear and the hunger. His mother and father were deported. They never came back from the camps. He was raised by his grandmother who survived. It was very moving. I felt ashamed and annoyed to see that the other students were distracted and weren't really listening. I was upset, even though I've already seen a lot of films about the Holocaust. When he'd finished speaking, I went up to speak to him. I told him that my grandmother had survived another genocide and that today was April 20th, the sad anniversary that it was 20 years ago to the day that the massacres had begun in her city, Butare. I don't know if it was because he was tired or his hearing aid wasn't working very well, but he didn't seem to hear me or seem to be listening to me. He just said, 'Oh yes, Rwanda, the Hutus and the Tutsis, just awful. It was just awful. Africa is tough, isn't it? Even today, just look at all these people fleeing to Europe.' And then he left. I was really disappointed. I didn't even ask to take a photo with him, even though I wanted to send it to you, with this book that I just finished, the one that Maman gave me. It's by Imre Kertész. Remember we did? He was just about my age during the Holocaust, and his sarcastic tone reminds me of you. You'll write and tell me what you think of it. Many kisses across the sea. So this is what this teenage grandson writes his grandmother about, and I thought, now that's interesting. Now, I mean, just this idea that he was expecting this boy whose grandmother was a survivor was expecting more from this older man. But then he says, well, maybe he didn't hear me. Maybe he was tired. Maybe that's what it was, just not. But he was disappointed because he was expecting that this survivor of another Holocaust, of a genocide, would be more sympathetic to him. So that was one little reference there. And I remember, what was the book by Imre Kertész? We did it a number of years ago. What was it? Anyway, he's an interesting voice. He was a Hungarian writer. I don't know, wrote in Hungarian or in German. He was 15 years old when he survived Auschwitz, and he wrote about his experience in Auschwitz, but he wrote about it in a very strange, unusual voice. And now I can't remember the title of the book, and we did it. Because he was the same age, he was similar age to Elie Wiesel, and yet and you read one book and the other book, and it's very different. But in any case, one of the points that Beata, the author, makes in an interview is that when it was a British interviewer was saying to her, people have said that these things to describe them, they're indescribable. And she said, and she answers back and she says, I don't know if it's so much indescribable, because nothing is really indescribable, which I also thought was a very interesting point, because with reference to the Holocaust, also you could say it was just indescribable. There are no words to describe these things. And she says, no, there are words to describe these things. It might be unhearable or unlistenable to. That's the issue. It's not that it's not describable if the person is able to describe. In this case, you have Immaculata who goes mute after a certain point because she isn't able emotionally to describe it. But at one point, before she stopped talking, she was able to describe it. But the author of this book says, this is an interesting idea, that it's not that these horrors, there are words, writers know how to do it. You don't have to be a great writer, you can describe things. but whether people want to listen to you, that's the issue. So 30 years, almost 30 years, she said that was enough time, I felt, to be able to write this book. And it's the same with Holocaust literature, mainly. I mean, there were a few books that were written very soon after, but the majority of writers, it took a while to be able for them to, and two things. Yes, it took a while to be able for them to speak for whatever emotion, reasons emotionally. Some were never able to speak, but for the writers, I mean, Elie Wiesel's book Night, which was one of the seminal pieces and the genre of what has become the genre of Holocaust literature. He wrote that in 1967. And so that was 20 years after, or at least the English translation, I don't know, because he wrote originally in Yiddish and in French. I don't know, I think Night was maybe written in Yiddish and then translated to French, or maybe in French first, I don't know, anyway, because Elie Wiesel was a journalist living in Paris at the time. But 20 years. And then, on the other hand, I remember my parents coming. My parents are Hungarian Holocaust survivors, came here separately, but I remember my father never really talked about whether he talked about it or not. But my mother came and she said, we didn't talk about it just because nobody wanted to hear about it. And never mind, we're not talking non-Jews, we're talking Jews, Canadian Jews did not want to hear about what we had been through. So we didn't talk about it. We were the greeners and we didn't talk. And that's why they married, survivors tended to marry each other because they could relate to it. So this idea of unlistenable, I thought was very interesting. So as I say, it's almost 30 years now that she writes about this, and she's chosen a very interesting way to do it through these three different voices and the three generations. And you could say that the novel, as one of the reviewers said, is a poignant meditation on the violence that ruptured so many lives. So this 1994 genocide of the Tutsi people that devastated Rwanda in just 100 days is explored face on and obliquely, or like sideways through the characters of how, and it explores really what it wants to do is exploring how the aftermath of this horrific killing affected 3 generations of one family. So as I said, the grandmother Immaculata survives the massacres in Butari by hiding in the basement of her Hutu neighbor's bookshop. So in that case, she was in a Hutu neighbor's bookshop. Her son, she has 2. She has Blanche, is her daughter by one father, a Frenchman, so she's of mixed race, and her son Bosco, who is a few years younger. His father, and there's another thing, his father, Immaculata's lover, and that's why they couldn't marry, because it was one of these, like Romeo and Juliet, except that he was Hutu. And she falls in love with him when she's a teenager, and she becomes pregnant and has this son. So one daughter, Blanche, is mixed race, and the son is mixed ethnicities in Rwanda, Hutu and Tutsi, because Immaculata is Tutsi and her lover was Hutu. So her son is, and he joins in the story, we find out that he's joined the exiled rebel army, while her daughter Blanche has escaped to France, where she meets her husband and settles in Bordeaux with their child, Stokely, and that's the Stokely, the grandchild. And so the novel is, as I said, narrated from the perspectives of Blanche, Immaculata, and Stokely, and it looks at the women's experiences, their struggle to come to terms with the trauma and the survivor's guilt. Because Blanche feels guilt that she managed to escape. Her mother did not. Her mother starved, hidden in this basement, did survive physically, but how emotionally scarred she was is what both Immaculata has to deal with, and what her daughter, this survivor's guilt that is not uncommon to survivors when, why was I chosen to survive, whereas my mother, father, brother, sister, who else was not? Why? Which are very hard to deal with. And they are also emblematic of the nation, of the Rwandan nation's attempt to heal itself. And so you get it, as I said, saga seems a big word for a book of only 180 pages, But you get a lot packed into those 180 something pages, because you have Immaculata, the grandmother, reflecting on her childhood under Belgium's protectorate and how in secondary school, as I said, she was forbidden to speak her mother tongue, Kinyarwanda. And again, words, books, words, literature. Now the author is as I said, a poet, short story writer, now novelist, for whom words are her thing. Although, interestingly, she wasn't always a writer. She said, I came to writing relatively late. I was into my 30s when I started to write, says the author. She studied political science at university, and she worked for humanitarian organizations. But Immaculata ponders in the book on the ability of words to do all kinds of things, but what they can do is to dehumanize. And if you remember, well, as all propaganda does, in an attempt to get populations, during the Holocaust, what did the Germans liken the Jews to cockroaches and to vermin, and they had to be exterminated. You use the term exterminated on insects, on vermin. That was, the Germans thought that one up. So, but the same thing here, that apparently the Hutus were on these radio broadcasts, and wherever they could, they were telling that the Tutsis were cockroaches, and I do remember that, reading that term back 30 years ago when they were reporting about it. Cockroaches, so cockroaches are, you have to get rid of them, you step on them, you get rid of them as quickly as you can. And so this is what Immaculata, in her mute state, at least at the present bit when she's mute, when she's not talking, she ponders the ability of words to dehumanize, to pierce brutally like a spear. But she also then finds solace and refuge in books that can nurture her and can nurture kinship and peace and reconciliation. Blanche, what is her role in this story is she interrogates her identity, because as I said, she's mixed race, she's light-skinned, she lives in Europe, but where does she truly belong? And then language, she says, the character says, which could be maybe the author speaking the same thing, that she says, speaking French is like a decorative veneer, a public corset, ridiculous and pretentious, whereas her mother tongue is her backbone, the language in which she expressed her sorrows and kept her secrets. So this, words, prose, books, literature, and apparently, in French, it must be very beautiful. The English translation is very well done too. I mean, the sentences, when I looked at them, I don't know, you don't translate literally from one language to the other, but they are beautifully crafted, and they convey feelings and moods. And they use these interesting expressions, which maybe they are, I don't know if they're from French or they're from Rwandan. I hanged myself on my tongue. Silence is a shield. A smile, I'm just giving you some examples. A smile is like a dove flying over a courtyard in the late morning sun. Where does the title of the book come from? It comes from, I don't know if this is a bit of irony here, but from the Catholic liturgy. That's what the author tells us this in the book. Gather to yourself all your children scattered throughout the world. So that's where the book gets its title, because after these massacres, and even, well, those who were lucky enough before, or just as they were beginning to get away, created a Rwandan exile of, many hundreds of thousands, whoever could flee, fled. So a diaspora of Rwandans living abroad was created. So you get this, that's where the title, All Your Children Scattered, is appropriate. But as I say, interesting that it comes from the Catholic liturgy, because Catholicism and the Catholic Church were the ones, yes, they educated, as they did in many countries, Canada included, educated the natives, to bring them up to the civilized European Christian status. But on the other hand, especially now in today's world, it's looked upon, not positively. She, as I told you, this is her first novel, and it's viscerally very powerful. And in exploring the trauma through the 3 generations, I think at this point where it's almost, close to 30 years now since this genocide, is a very effective way of presenting the subject to an audience to make it listenable. Because, as she said, that it's not that there are topics that are unspeakable, but it's how to get an audience, in this case, a readership, to listen to what you want to say when you talk about a topic that is so difficult and so horrific in the annals of history, in the story of recent humankind. I guess, well, it's 3 o'clock already, so does anybody, I think it's very interesting. It's a short book. It's not, it's literature, I guess you could call it, if you want to say it's more of a literary story. But to me, worth reading because it's a very interesting new voice. And she has a way of telling a story that, at least by the time I finished it, makes you think about questions that, let's say, from a Jewish Holocaust survivor, child of that I am, perspective, is it was interesting the areas that she looks at that are not all that different. I mean, horrific killings are horrific killings, not to compare any one killing with another and numbers and that, but it just the horrors of what people can do to each other and how they can hate each other, and yet on the other hand, what do you do with that as part of man's nature, the evil that is inherent apparently in all of us, when it's brought to the surface, versus the wonderful goodness of people that is also inherent in human beings. And that's what she's looking at in this story. Any questions, comments? I know most of you haven't read it, but yeah.
Okay, I think that question or problem of reaching people who will listen to it now is not a problem anymore, because these problems are manifesting again and they're of interest again. And in Hebrew they say in Chadash Tachas Hashemesh.
There's nothing new under the sun, right? Yeah,
And
yeah.
things keep repeating themselves. And you have the tragedy of Syria, you have the tragedy of, and you have even in the States what's happening now. We're on the verge of who knows what, killing your neighbors. You had Kosovo, the same thing. I mean, and
In Serbia.
In Serbia,
yeah,
Kosovo.
Yeah, where you had
you
neighbors,
know,
and then you had
it's
neighbors.
evil is a theme that goes on, and talk about UN. What happened to these people, these Hutus that committed these crimes? Were they brought to justice?
Well, there were tribunals, from what I had read. There were tribunals, but it was hard to. It was hard to pinpoint. It was hard to, yes, certain ones were brought to, but as I was reading too, the justice system after the genocide, that it fell apart. There was, and she says at one point in the book where I think Stokely gets a letter from his grandmother, and he says, or maybe it was even before that, where he says, it took a while for the country to be printing postage stamps again. Because everything fell apart. There were, I forget what I was reading, 50 judges left in Rwanda after the killings that were able to, so trials were very, very difficult. Yes, the leaders, I think, again, I don't remember all the details of what I had read, were brought to trial, but
They found somebody in Montreal who was involved in the Rwanda massacre.
yeah,
I'm sure they're everywhere.
It's just like after the war.
after the.
Look what the United States did. They brought in all these German scientists and for the bomb.
For the bomb, yeah.
There's another book written, maybe 2008, 2009, called Sunday at the Pool.
Sunday at Home in Kigali. Yeah.
Written by a Montrealer. It was written, his name was Gil Courtemanche. And that's like a story with a lot more description.
Yeah,
And it's about a Canadian aid worker who falls in love with one of the Tutsi women, and it's a fascinating read. It's much more gruesome. This one talked about feeling, not the actual action, but if you're looking for another book.
Yes,
on
that's
the
it.
subject,
Sunday at the
Sunday at the
pool
pool
in
in
Kilgallen.
Kilgallen. It's
Yes.
a very good
Yeah, thank you.
descriptor of
Yes.
the time.
Yes.
There's also
Yeah.
another book written by a survivor that I wrote. She was,
Hotel Rwanda?
not a hotel room,
Yeah.
it was a hotel room?
I don't know.
Yeah.
But she was a young girl and and they came to the house and and next door and hid in the bathroom and it was so graphic that you really feel it viscerally. What happened, I bought the book and I don't know if I said that.
And they were pogroms, you know, they were pogroms like the pogroms that when it's a,
Nothing new.
no, and in this case, very unfortunately, yes.
Was there like the two groups, they made caricatures of each other to see how they recognize each other facially? Tutsis and the Hutus.
You mean because of the
Yeah,
the
they-
facial
this one,
features,
yeah.
right? Yeah, apparently they are differentiating,
Yeah, but
like
you
they
know,
could,
like what a bunch of baloney, because they had a lot of them had previously.
yeah, because, and they
so
spoke,
on.
right,
And they weren't at war with each other, and there was, anyway, one of the teachers I taught with, he was a soldier in Rwanda at the time. He came back, PTSD messed up, and he became an art teacher, okay? But he just couldn't talk about it, ever, and I worked with him.
this was
before I
a
was
Canadian,
hired.
a Canadian soldier,
Canadian,
the
yeah,
Canadian, like the
Canadian
UN
War,
forces
yeah.
there,
Yeah.
yeah,
And I worked with him for over 10 years.
Yeah.
Never could open his mouth about it, he just like, can't tell you.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
like when Romeo the Lair started
Yeah.
talking about it, he
Yeah.
said, he's right,
yeah,
but we have to follow orders, and he said it was horrible.
yeah.
Whatever happened to UN allowed, if they knew what was happening,
They
they're supposed to
they
save
left.
the world, I wouldn't give a say.
Okay,
left.
what are they doing about
left.
Ukraine right
They
now?
left, that was one of the biggest like blemishes on their record, they left, yeah. Anyway, thank you very much, and if you get hold of it won't take you long to read it. Worth listening to, a
Thank
new
you.
voice, and if you're interested in listening to her, she speaks English beautifully too. First, I listened to these interviews in French, and then I found one, this British Shakespeare books or something, and they interview authors, and it was, yeah, she speaks English really beautifully, so.
And those are names are good.
Beata, so she has interest there, so right, the mother in the book is Immaculata, the daughter Beata.
It's also
Blanche.
religious, isn't it, Beata?
Very Catholic, French,
Very
yeah.
Very poetic.
Well, yeah, so she's,
Book is
her first
very
love is
poetic.
poetry, so,
Very
yeah,
cool.
yeah.
I haven't read it, but.
Yeah.
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 Running like a